Hi, and welcome back to the Marrow Thieves. My name's Emily. Today's chapter is The Four Winds. We're on page 56. And in this chapter, we start to see our characters coming together as a team, and we're learning a little bit more about how they work together to ensure their survival. So we'll get started. We headed northwest, up towards the shallows of James Bay, where the whales used to migrate before they packed up and headed down to Australia for good. After the Indians left, the industries and businesses in and around their territories closed up too. Small-time fisheries, hunting camps, tourist traps. After that, the big ones started to fall. Large-scale resorts, fly-in luxury cottages, and wilderness getaways for stressed businessmen and their foreign investors. In light of the wars and the rush to adapt and survive, no one really gave a shit about tourism, gross domestic profit, or low-level jobs for rurally located folks. Though they cared enough to kick everyone out when their former employees tried to bunk down in the once plush rooms and make use of the supplies and heat. They fenced them off, boarded them up, and some even hired security firms to walk around the perimeter to make sure that no one was looking to survive on corporate-sponsored vacancy. This is where we were now, up against the high fences surrounding Four Winds Resort, according to the faux marble sign at the end of the weed-cracked driveway on the other side. 10, maybe 12 feet. Chiboy was eyeing the top of the fence. Razor wire edging, electric charge mechanism. I'll doubt they're still electrified. That would mean the generators still worked. Miig sounded more hopeful than he looked. Only one way to find out, I suppose. Miig put his pack sack on the ground, pulled the sash off his forehead, and let his bedroll drop behind his feet. He spit into his palms and rubbed them together. Okay. He took a deep breath and squared his shoulders. I saw what he meant to do when he nudged his bedroll out of the way, took a few steps back, shaking out his arms and rolling his head on the stem of his neck. Shit. Rose hissed like a recoiling snake, her hand reaching to cover Riri's eyes in anticipation of Miig dancing an electric jig, sizzling like a piece of frying meat. I saw it in Chiboy's face, the way he suddenly looked young. I saw it in Minerva's eyes before they snapped shut, behind wrinkles clenched like fat fists. I felt it in my own pulse. Miig was too important to lose. We couldn't manage without him, and yet here he was, about to take a run at a potentially electrified fence so that we could be sheltered and fed for another night. I locked my eyes on Rose, on that bowed cord of vein and muscles that curved from her earlobe down to her neck to her collarbone, and took a quick step to the right and forward. Before Miig could start his run, before I could lose my nerve, I reached out and took two chain links into my fingers. I felt the electricity enter my hand, shoot up my arm, and land like a ball of hornets into my aorta. I swear I did, but it was just adrenaline, because there were no sparks, no smell of barbecue pork, no blindness. There was just that stream of breath and blood and tension rolling from Rose's ear down under the collar of her faded parka. We're good. I wanted it to sound more confident, bigger, with more nonchalant swagger. Instead, it sounded like the squeak of a 16-year-old boy who had to check with the back of his left hand that he didn't just wet himself. I released the links and pushed my shaking hand through my hair to give it somewhere to hide. Chiboy slapped me on the shoulder before he leapt onto the fence with a Pendleton blanket thrown across the back of his neck like a towel. He clambered to the top. Minerva clapped and smiled, watching him go like a tall Cree monkey. The stress smoothed away from her opened eyes. Chiboy tossed the Pendleton over the razor wire at the top and scrambled over. He walked his way down about 8 feet, then dropped the rest of the way with just the smothered crunch of gravel to mark his arrival. Wab herded the group over to the huge front gates. They waited there as Chiboy carefully snapped the glass window in the guard booth and slid it out of the frame. He slipped his long body through the square hole to search out a key on some kind of mechanism that would allow the others in without having to climb. No one is more important than anyone else, French. It was Miig, still standing a few steps back. No one should be sacrificed for anyone else. I tried to laugh it off, shrugging and starting a stream of no big deal sentiments, but he refused to allow it. I'm not joking, boy. He held my gaze until the smile disappeared from my face and my cheeks began to burn. Only then did he bend to gather up his things and walk over to the rest of the group by the front gates. If they had heard, no one let on. I was busy feeling sorry for my unappreciated heroics, and myself in general, and didn't see Rose there until she briefly took my hand. There was that electricity again, except this time the hornets had bilious wings because they swarmed with texture and speed from my heart down to my groin. She pressed the pad of her thumb into the shaking center of my hand, then let it go and walked away. That was all. The smile returned, slightly, in the wake of Miig's reproach. The gates popped open with a metallic screech, and we slipped through the small gap rust and atrophy would allow. Cheeboy waited for me to step through last, and then locked the gates back up by hand. Then he slid by me in the shadows and made his way to the front, but off to the side so he could scout. I finally looked up when we returned to the bend in the driveway and caught my breath. I'd spent most of my early life in the crumbling east end of the city, surrounded by urban decay and concrete waste, where the skyline had looked like a ruined mouth of rotted teeth. That is, except for these last few years out in the bush, where we ran and home was campfire and canvas tent. Not that it was bad. It's just that neither extreme had prepared me for the Four Winds resort. From the outside, it looked like an oversized cottage, all wood and peaks and log pillars holding up odd angles and juts. It rose 3 stories with a front entranceway that stretched out the front as a long corridor. We made our way to the doors and waited while Cheeboy snapped the locks off with the cutters he kept in his roll. Then Tree and Ziguan pried off the boards and opened the old doors with much effort and squealing of joints. Miig watched the darkness beyond the gates, nervously. The moon lit the wide front hall in pale ribbons, turning the dust and broken bits of chair and wainscoting and climbing vines from feral houseplants into fairy tale turrets. We walked slowly out of habit, out of fear, but also now out of reverence. The space felt untouched. We could feel the thrum of old activities sliding along the floorboards, caught in the keyholes of closed doors. Everything had been shut tight while so much was still supposed to happen. The intent and plans hadn't had time to vacate. And here we were, now, opening the lid of a sealed jar, and all the anticipation of a tomorrow planned 1,000 yesterdays ago came skittering to our feet like slick-shelled beetles. The lower windows were all boarded up on either side of the hallway, done professionally with sheets of reinforced plywood backed with crossed 2x4s. But the skylight arching out over the hallway above showed us that the night through glass opaque with greasy animal prints, bird shit, and weather. Still, there were stars, and we passed down the hall 2x2 like visiting dignitaries underneath them. At the end of the hallway was a dark hole. The glass ceiling and boarded up walls ended, and whatever lay ahead was covered in silence and blackness. We gathered at the dark opening, waiting to know what to do. Once our eyes adjusted, we could make out lighter rectangles of gray on the far extremes of the space. That's where Miig and Cheeboy went, to the lighter patches in the unknown. I kept my eyes to the right and saw Miig's hands suddenly dark on the gray. He pulled back what I understood then to be drapes, and swatches of sky diluted this dark with soft moonlight. He passed by a stone mantel set in the wall and repeated the same on the other side. Across the room, Cheeboy also found floor-length windows on either side of a stone-mantled fireplace. We took in the room, quickly at first to scan for danger, and then with more care to see everything we could in this space. That was not forest or dilapidated barn. Do you think the fireplaces still work? Wab was almost happy. which was a strange tone coming from her serious face. Miig shook his head. Doesn't matter. We can't use them. Fire comes with smoke, and this isn't a low campfire. Those chimneys would push smoke up past the tree line pretty damn quick. The curves of her shoulders slumped, but she said nothing in return. But we can light up all these candles here. He touched a cream-colored pillar near the circumference of Riri on the mantel. There were more alongside it of various heights and widths. There were even more on the low, round table in front of the fireplace. What are these? It was Slopper. He ran his hands along a sheet-covered lump. There were 2 of these, one on either side of the table. Here. Cheeboy yanked the edge of the sheet and a long, sage-hued sofa appeared. Slopper looked skeptical until Cheeboy sat on it, tested the springs by bouncing a bit, and then lay down with an exaggerated sigh, folding his hands behind his head. Slopper ran around the table and pulled a sheet off the second one, getting tangled pretty good in voluminous folds and coughing from dust. With Riri's help, he was freed, and the pair bounced and giggled on the sofa's matched set. Miig and Wab were lighting the candles, and the room became lighter and smaller, and the space more defined. After so much time in the wide open, I was pleased to be contained. I sat on the edge of the couch and watched this new place illuminate. The walls were cedar and the floors covered with carpet in a pattern of autumn leaves caught in a circular wind. Behind us, to the left of the entrance from the glass hallway, was a counter. There was an open space behind it and a wooden plaque hanging on the back wall with letters burned in. Front desk. I walked over and around the counter and slid in behind. There was a telephone on the wall, the old kind with the curly cord attached. I picked it up and its weight shocked me. I couldn't put it to my ear, the motion too foreign, so I placed it gently back into its metal cradle. A stack of impossibly thick yellow books, the edges curling up like fiddleheads, were piled on the floor, leaning up against the wall. I crouched behind the counter and inspected a half wall of cubbyholes. In one was a shallow box of pens monogrammed with the same logo we'd seen on the sign outside the building. In another was a collection of little clips and fasteners of various sizes. In a half dozen others were papers, some written on, some others sealed, and some with line after line of careful script crossed out with thick colored lines. In a bottom hole was a 6-pack of bottled water. I grabbed that and slid it above me, over the counter. Woohoo! Water! I heard stomping as Riri and Slopper bounded over to retrieve the precious find. Then the reproach of the others, warning them to not open it yet, to wait, to ration. I laughed to myself, imagining Slopper's cheeks hanging in disappointment. Beside the cubbies was a long, very narrow drawer, as tall as the counter it was set into, and only wide enough to accommodate a coin-sized handle. What's this? I gave it a good yank, anticipating the resistance of time and atrophy so that when it slid, it easily opened. I fell on my ass, knob in hand. There was a clatter of metal on metal. Miig came forward, bending on a knee. Keys. He read the numbered plates, then looked up to the stairs curving up to a second floor from either side of the great room. Room keys. We shuffled up the stairs, kicking balls of dust and busted plaster as we went. As was custom, Miig and Cheeboy took up the vulnerable front and back positions. Everyone but Minerva held a candle. I stood as tall as I could behind Miig, peering over his shoulder ahead and down over the railing into the great room lit on the far side by the remaining candles. I tried to open my eyes as far as I could to be as useful as possible. I was focused, but not so much that I couldn't feel Rose reaching for my elbow when we got to the top. Wab carried the keys in the cradle she'd made out of the front of her sweater, and they slid against each other like low metallic groans. We turned towards the dark in front and illuminated a flickering tunnel of doors. Each one was labeled with a small plaque inscribed with a number. Wab walked the line and handed a key to each person. Miig nodded, and Cheeboy went to the first door on the right side of the hall with the matched key. He put it into the lock, filled his lungs with air so his shoulders rose halfway to his ears, and pushed. The suck of air was audible and popped low in my eardrum like a lid being lifted. And when Cheeboy disappeared into the room, I panicked a bit and crossed the hall to take up space he'd left in the doorway. Cheeboy walked the perimeter of the room before setting the candle down on a small round table in front of another empty fireplace on a much smaller scale than those in the great room. He moved to the bed set against the wall and slowly folded his length on top of the comforter. It was to big enough for 6 pillows, side by side and stacked 3 deep. He adjusted the pillows under his head and nuzzled into the skin of the made bed like a child. It made me smile, seeing Chi-Boy, the fierce scout, bending his arms under his weight, wiggling his ass to get into the softness with a goofy grin on his face. I ran back out to the hallway and down to the door with my number on it. The lock was stiff, and I turned it twice before it gave and the door swung in. Riri was behind me, holding her candle at my elbow. I could feel the pinch of its heat. She gasped into the space, a whole empty, contained space, and followed me in. I threw open the curtains covering the windows on the far wall and illuminated the carpet on the floor. It was a mass of vines and blooms that twisted sinisterly into the flame, but sat docile and domestic in the moonlight. "This place is huge," she said. "I know." "Who needs this much space?" she asked. "Not sure." I pulled off my torn boots with the toe of the other stepping on the heel. It felt wrong to tromp around in outside shoes. "You didn't check for snakes first, Frenchie." She was upset. "Sorry, Ree." Took the candle from her and walked the perimeter of the room, holding it under the small table and dropping to my knees to check under the bed. The corners were choked with dust, and it smelled like a whole metropolis of mice had lived and bred there, probably until the cats got wise and moved in before moving on. But no snakes. "All clear, no snakes, just some regular old monsters under the bed, that's it." "Really?" Rose answered from just inside the door. "I knew we should have stopped to grab holy water for the buggers on the way in here." I smiled. I couldn't help the size of it either. She made me look stupid when she was around. "Come on, Rose. Let's go into your room next." Riri grabbed her by her forearm and spun her out of the room, making Rose's long, dark hair fan out and settle across her shoulders like a shawl. We each checked into a room, made ourselves comfortable, then trudged back down the stairs to grab our gear and bring up the other candles. There was no use risking theft or discovery because of a few pinpoints of light reflected in an abandoned window. It was strange, all of us separated by walls, divided into compartments like bees in a dusty hive, so we kept our doors open. I could hear Riri laughing and the rhythmic thump of bed springs as someone jumped. She and Slopper ran up and down the hall a few times before Slopper, wheezing and holding his rounded side, huffed, "All right, enough. Geez, let's lay down a bit." Miig paced the hall every hour, always on patrol, and Wob spent a long time in Minerva's room getting her washed up and ready for bed. Minerva was beside herself with joy. She would have spent the longest in a real bedroom before the hunt began, way more than any of us. I heard her speak in full, lovely sentences from my room across the hall. "Where's my nightie?" she asked. "You don't have a nightie, Minerva, but look, you can change into your summer dress to sleep in tonight." "I need to boil some tea there. We should have some tea." "Can't have a fire tonight, Min. How about let's split one of these waters before bed?" "Make sure you close the curtains again, you. If you sleep in that moonlight, you'll wake up blind." "Okay. There, they're all shut." "No, no, don't put the candles out yet. Bring the girls in. I want to tell yous about the Roguru tonight." I caught my breath. An old-timey story. I heard Wob come to the hallway and whistle a two-note tune. Then Riri and Rose shuffled in. I stayed in my room until they were settled, then crept into the hall and settled by the open door. The rise and fall of Slopper's soft snore spilled into the space. Tree and Zequan had filed into a single room, and the door was closed, locking them in together. And there was no flickering coming from either Miig's or Chi-Boy's rooms, which meant they were either asleep or on patrol. So I was safe from discovery. This is my grandmare's story. Told to me when me and my sisters were turning into women. It's about Roguru, the dog that haunts the half-breeds, but keeps the girls from going on the roads at night, where the men travel. Down by the river to draw water, I feel eyes on the back of my neck, smell the blood on his tongue, even with the sweetgrass tight under my arm. I stand and turn fast, already spit against the back of my teeth, hissing like a badger. But no, the Roguru just watches. Didn't even blink, him. Yes, Roguru. I know one when I see it. Too big to be a dog, black as pitch, eyes yellow as new ragweed. I try to ignore him, turn my back even, but still I hear him breathing, not panting like a real dog, just slow ins and outs like a calm, everyday man. So I turn again, this time raising my arms to make me bigger. My sweetgrass falls all around my feet. I remember. I can smell it real strong, even over his stench. I growl, a throat sound with no gut in it. He looks up at my hands, then stands up all smooth like smoke in the coldest sky. All air, no wind. Yes, now I am intimidated, but no fear. There is no time for that nonsense. He is bigger than old Pitou Magnon, and that man was a giant among Christians. What happened next is my old trapline instincts. Still hold that heavy dipper for the water. It is still in my hand, and I bring it across the space between us. Now I see him. He's moved to right here in front of me. That old dipper, my mother carved that from the birch we stripped out back and gave it to me when Pierre died. She said it was heavy enough to chase off hungry men. But a widow in this settlement has no need. Up till now, it has only been used for water. Till now, when it became the Roguru beating stick. That dipper lands straight on the tender of the beast's nose. Oh, mon Dieu! The noise, the terrible crack like a buffalo gun. Then nothing. I see the thing looking straight at me, and then a gash opens up, all slow and oozing out the top of its snout. And as the good Lord is my witness, when that first drop of blood lands on its thick chest, he changes. More terrible cracks and tears. I watch bones moving under his skin. The fur comes off in clumps, and all the while his insides are moving his outsides like fish spawning in the shallows. Oh, it is sickening. Reminds me of lying in childbed. At the end of it, his limbs are too long but human, and there he stands, a tall, naked man. And he has that hunger there. I see it, same way I sees it in the men sometimes. Okay, Minerva, it's getting late. Wob, sensing a dark turn in the tale, tried to cut her off. I need to get Riri into bed now. Ah, Wob, I want to hear the story about the dog. Some more. Riri sounded tired, even through her protest, I heard feet hit the ground as she was made to stand from the bed and marched out the door. I crouched to the side as they passed. After a minute, Minerva picked up the tale again, speaking in the heavily accented voice of her grandmother. It starts with that violence and ends with that singing in my guts, another kind of violence. He comes as beast, and I make him bleed. It started with that dipper, then it was a switch cut from the same birch, then I grew tired of tools. As we become more like man and wife, year after year, I bite him the way I thought he would like to bite me. When I bring the blood, he brings the man. And mother and grandmère are Catholic, and Catholic are all raced, and I am just a woman. I am marked. Talk to the old man there, down at the shore, and he talks about Rogurus. I don't ask, I think he can just tell. He says they kill unless met without fear. He says once you are marked, that dog will keep coming back. He says even when you are on your deathbed, he will come. Every full moon, every year until you're in the ground. Then he looks for the next one, says he finds it in the family, marks them the same way. Now I know I am damned, because my sin is my family's sin. Oh, mon Dieu, who in this family deserves such a curse? Who in my own bloodline will have to miss the Jesus in the heavens because of my weakness? There was a pause. Minerva. Rose spoke softly. Another space. Minerva. She was answered by a peal of crunchy snoring. Good night, Kokum. I didn't have time to move back to my room before Rose was at the door, the candle she carried throwing my crouching shadow and her standing shadow into knots on the floor. I was embarrassed at being caught eavesdropping. She just gave me a small, tight smile and, with a weird look in her eye, turned away and disappeared into a doorway, 2 up from this one. I slunk back to my room. I slept in just my shorts, wrapped up under the stiff blankets, surrounded by a barrier of dense pillows. I let my candle stay lit. I knew it was an extravagance I would regret later, when we didn't have any more portable light, but I enjoyed the way it flickered and jumped in the small breezes from the crumbling window panes, jumping against the walls and ceilings so that I remembered there were walls and ceilings around me once more. Despite the long day and the late hour, I couldn't sleep. Sloppers and Minerva's snoring filled the hallways with familiarity, and every now and then I heard a cough or a sneeze that reminded me we were all still together. Still, I could not sleep. Instead, I stared at the small shadows and big emptiness of the starless ceiling. There was a creak and a click, and my door was shut. I pulled myself up quick onto my elbows, eyes adjusting to reach into the dark. When she got almost to the other side of the wide bed and into the circle of the candle's glow, I saw that it was Rose, and I stopped breathing. She was wearing a gray t-shirt that fell midway down her lean thighs. Her braid was undone and her hair hung in black waves. She looked directly at me but didn't smile. There was something else on her face, though. My breathing came back in double time. My heart was an echo in my ears. She climbed onto the bed, and I moved over a bit to give her space. Still looking at me, she lifted the covers and slid under, beside me. I felt the complete length of her then, like a warm sliver under my ribs. It was the best thing I'd ever felt. It made me brave, and I adjusted my arm so that it was a pillow under her head, so that all that soft hair could cover it like a web. Then she began talking. Everyone in my family is short. Every last one of us. When I was younger and we still had the house, my mother would pull out old photos of her people. Not the printed up kind from computers, but the shiny kind on real film papers. Every one of her relatives was tiny. Even when they were fat, their height made them compact. My mom barely cleared 5 feet. My dad, well, he came from a less challenged lineage. He was from the islands, and his people were pretty damn tall. He stood around 5'10". Me, I was 8 pounds when I was born, and my mother never forgave me for it. My mom said her family came from the White River Reserve before it was amalgamated into the wider Kenora Band and then moved. She met my dad there when they brought over the last few families from Grassy Narrows. He was a student from the University of Winnipeg studying our plants and their medicines. My parents were taken together right at the beginning of the experiments before people knew they had to run like the devil himself was pissing on their heels. They didn't care he was half black and his kind of Indian was the kind from the warm oceans. Guess they were less picky when it came to brown. I was only 5 when they left me with Granny. We played a lot of ochre. She sent me out with my great uncles when they decided to hit the bush. She was too slow, she said, to come with us. So we left her in her little house on the old reserve lands. She refused to leave, with a dozen jugs of clean water and a pantry half full of cans. She said that was plenty, and any more would be wasted. I walked into the bush with my granny's brothers, William and Jonas, one afternoon, and kept walking for 6 years before the first one fell ill. We set up camp when he couldn't go on. We stayed there a full year before Will passed. We even grew a little patch of corn with seeds we'd brought from down south. After we buried him, Jonas and I packed up and started the walk again. We ran into a person every now and then, but Jonas never wanted to stay with them or have anyone come with us. He said he was charged with protecting me, and he couldn't trust no one with a little girl around. Jonas said our family had survived residential schools back in the old times, and those stories were kept on down the line. He wouldn't tell me much. He barely spoke now that Will was in the ground. But he did tell me to trust no one, to always make sure the camp was clear before I bedded down at night. A child needs walls, not brick and wood walls all the time, but some sort of walls to keep them in and others out, so they can play, and they can sleep, and they can move without the burden of eyes and hands. I'm that wall for you. When I'm gone, you make your own walls with this. Jonas told me, and he held out Will's hunting rifle to me. I learned to hunt small with wires and bigger with that gun. Jonas and I, we walked for hours and days and months together. We didn't really talk. He showed me things, though. You're a woman now, he told me a few years ago, right after I turned 13. That's what you follow now. He pointed to the full silver moon with 2 bent fingers. That's your granny. At about 8 months ago, Jonas didn't wake up. I dug the hole while he was still breathing, because I wasn't sure if I'd have the guts to do anything once he was gone, once it was just me. Thought about turning around, heading back to my granny, but I knew there was no turning around. I could see as sure as a fire in the trees that they were there and she wasn't, that she'd been swallowed up. though my bets were on her taking herself out before the schools could. I stayed by Jonas's grave for 4 days and 4 nights. On the last night, the full silver moon hung low in the sky like a heavy rock and plastic bag, ready to tear through the bottom onto your toes. Then I knew it was time. I cleaned up. I packed up and I walked. And now, well, here I am. When she was done, she settled her chin into the crook of my collarbone. Her breath poured into the space like tea into a cup. I felt the brush of her bottom lip on my skin there, and the small hairs of my arm lifted. She squeezed in closer, her stomach making contact with my side, bringing my full body to attention. I moved my free hand over the front of my shorts. Shit! I tried pushing it away. I swallowed hard and breathed, slow and steady like you do when you have game in sight and you don't want to scare it off. I hoped the concentration would take my excitement away. But then she moved her hand to cover mine, and I almost died. It was such exquisite clarity of blood and skin and breath that I felt like crying. Instead, I let her lace her fingers through mine, and I tilted my neck back so my face lined up with hers. Her eyes were half closed, lips open. She was the most beautiful girl in the world, and we were in a bed together. I watched the candlelight make red stars in her irises and thanked the Jesus I'd left it on. She moved her face forward just a few centimeters, and I took her lip between mine. She slid a knee over my thighs and pressed closer. My pulse was a hand drum in the cradle of my gut. I wasn't sure how long I could stand this before I just died from it. She pressed down on the front of my shorts with both our hands, and I couldn't have seen straight if my eyes had been open. French, can I sleep with you guys? We jumped, neither of us having heard the door open. Riri stood at the foot of the bed, rubbing her eyes with a fist. Holy Ree! I sat, bolt up, throwing Rose off to the side. Holy hell, I didn't hear you come in. She just stood there, I guess, with no precedent to go by. She wouldn't really understand the concept of knocking. I sighed. It was Rose who threw back the covers and invited her in, pushing me further to the edge of the bed with a hip. Come here, babe, get in. It's cold out there. She scrambled up the bed and jumped in beside Rose, pulling the older girl's arm over her like a comforter. I tried to curl myself around Rose's back, but the intimacy was further broken by Riri's feet, thrown backwards over Rose's knees, so that they jabbed into my legs like rounded icicles. Still, I was making the best of it, enjoying the smell of Rose's hair across the pillow, pushing my sore groin into her backside a bit, when Slopper appeared behind me. Move over, French, I can't sleep. Christ, what's wrong with everyone? I heard you snoring a minute ago. He just shrugged his heavy shoulders and pushed his way in behind me. And that was that. I woke up when Minerva started coughing. The sound was deafening as she was sitting in one of the tufted chairs in front of the fireplace in my room. I jumped when I saw her there. How long had she been sitting in my room? She waved to me when I lifted my head. Tried to wave back, but I couldn't lift my arm. In fact, my head was the only thing I could move. Slopper drooled on the pillow beside me, and Rose was stretched out, her head back on my arm, on the other side. Beside her was Riri, arms thrown out wide like she was making a great leap in her arms. Our feet were trapped under a weight on top of the blankets that turned out to be Tree and Ziguan lying perpendicular on top of the comforter. I slid my arm up from under Rose, an almost painful separation, and climbed over Slopper, almost stepping on Cheeboy, who was stretched out beside the bed, a discarded pillow under his head. Beside him was Wab. There were a few inches between them, but their breathing was matched, and in even greater intimacy than touch. So we were all here, all crammed into one room, all of us beside Miig. Morning, French. I see we ended up having a slumber party last night. Spoke too soon. There he was, stretching out his arms above his head while he leaned against the wall to the right of the closed door, his legs crossed in front of him. I gave him a half smile and combed my hair with my fingers, smoothing it back and down, sitting on the edge of my full bed. How the hell did everyone end up in here? I tried to remember. The memory of Rose punched me in the gut, and I stepped over Cheeboy and Wab to the adjoining bathroom to empty my bladder and catch my breath. Of course, there was no running water, so I just pissed down the sink and examined my face in the foggy mirror above it. At the end of day 2 at the Four Winds, Miig was already getting antsy. Everything in his gut saying, move, move, move. And Miig was a man who lived by his gut. I could see Cheeboy already scouting the property for things to take with us. In the corner of the great room, he'd stacked a wool blanket with wide-colored stripes, a couple of knives out the kitchen block, a dozen candles, a box of matchbooks stamped with the resort logo, every piece of food left in the pantry, which amounted to maybe 25 cans of beans, 6 cans of powdered milk, and a stainless steel kettle. What he didn't stack there, but when I saw him slip into his bedroll when I was supposed to be checking behind the desk for maps of the area, which I found on the back of a placemat, was a lady's trapper hat made from white fur with a thin leather ribbon tie dangling from the flaps. He'd found it in one of the storage rooms in the back and secreted it out to his bags under the folds of his gray sweater. I pretended to not notice. Outside, Miig had found a shed, and though it was pretty well scavenged from when they had first shut up shop, he did manage to find a two-wheeled cart, the kind you tow behind a four-wheeler. We'll patch up these tires and take it with us. It might prove to be more burden than an asset, so we'll test it out for a few days. If it works, it'll do for hauling Minerva on her off days. He took Tree and Zequan with him to try to repair the tires and test its weight capacity. Right now, Minerva had found a rocking chair in the back porch of the building. There was a whole row of them out there. Facing the back wall were thick sheets of wood had been nailed up against what must have been huge picture windows facing some kind of $1,000,000 view. I was on patrol and wandered the building, hoping to find some new thing that would make Miig agree to stay. Here we had beds and warmth and walls. It was luxurious. I didn't want to leave. And if I were being completely honest, I'd admit it had more to do with Rose's visit to my bed last night than anything else. A phenomenon that could maybe be coaxed out of heaven a second time. But I wasn't admitting anything. I followed a side hallway off the main room into the nest of tiny offices that lay back there. A janitor's supply closet, a long room with lockers on either side, some still locked, others open with photographs taped to the inside, and work jackets hung up, and finally a room with a desk and mountains of paper, with a plaque reading "Manager" on the door. I found Wab sitting behind the desk in the manager's office with a bottle balanced on a pile of yellowed printouts in front of her. When she lifted her head, she looked sleepy with her eyes half closed and a straight grimace on her lips. "Hey, Wab." She took a couple of deep breaths. I waited, shifting my weight from one foot to the other, fixed in her stare. "Do you know how shitty my mom was?" she asked me. I stared down at the tops of my taped-up boots. How should I answer? "So shitty, dude. So super shitty." This was the most she'd ever said directly to me. It was terrifying. "You have it shitty, Mom, Frenchie?" She picked up the bottle and spun the cap with the side of her hand. Came off the bottle and flew across the desk, clattering to the floor like a plastic coin. I shook my head. "Good for you, man. Good for you." She took a short swallow from the bottle and put it down hard. "You know what I did before I got here?" I looked at her. She wasn't looking at me anymore. She was tipping the bottle side to side, watching the amber liquid slosh and wave. "No." I ran. She laughed with no joy, like a cough racked with sickness. I backed away from the door. I felt like she should be alone. Not sure I wanted her to keep talking. Instead, she got dark, stood as on a wire, and made her way around the desk. I didn't move, not sure of what my role was here or if she even still saw me. I wasn't sure until she fell on my neck and sobbed right as T-Boy came around the corner. Wab was the one I was the most anxious around until Rose joined the group. We were all a little uneasy around her, I think. She was hard to figure out, harder even than Miig or Minerva. Their personas were clear. Their trauma was stark and motivating. Wab's was less defined, messier somehow, and therefore more dangerous. Wab was movie star beautiful, all tall and harsh. When I first came to the group, she was still wearing an eye patch, like a real villain. Now she just faced the world with one eye, a long red slash from her right cheekbone to the middle of her forehead over the other. The scar had knotted itself into a raw seam that closed the socket forever. Her teeth were straight and white. Her hair was down to her butt and burnt a warm umber from the sun. She chopped wood better than Miig and was stingy with her words. She could crush aluminum cans with a bent flex of half calf and thigh, and every boy, myself included, for as long as I could remember, had at one point harbored a secret crush and more than a few nighttime fantasies over Wab. We'd begged Miig for her coming to story, since she'd never waste enough words to share it herself. We'd been on a hunt the last time we really drilled him for info on our mysterious love interest, a little before Rose showed up. I heard after she killed a man with a pair of scissors in the city, she pulled her own eye out so she'd never have to look at herself in the mirror again, Slopper had said with round eyes and dramatic breaths. I heard she was a mercenary for one of the West Side gangs, said Tree, and that she lost her eye when an East Side gang attacked their clubhouse, said Ziguan. And that was when she woke up and saw her eye was missing. She found the East Siders, said Tree, and killed them all, removing the eye from each body before she left for the bush, finished Ziguan. Chiboy just laughed at us. Miig leaned over the trap he was trying to show us how to reset and beckoned us in with a lowered voice. Then I guess you boys better be careful who you dream about without her pants on. We turned 4 shades of red. Even Chiboy was a little pink in the neck, revealing that maybe his dreams were little more than wolves and grandfather teachings. Besides, he added, as went back to hooking the spring in its latch, everyone tells their own coming to story. That's the rule. Everyone's creation story is their own. Together, Chiboy and I carried her to the main room and set her on the couch, still teary but silent again. The twins ran and got Miig, who lit a small smudge for Wab. Normally we'd bring everyone together for a smudge, but the air was dark and the littlest kids were safe on the back porch in rocking chairs with Minerva. Wab took handfuls of thick smoke and rubbed her face. I wasn't sure she'd talk. Miig sat quietly beside her, staring at his fingers laced into each other. Rose and I sat cross-legged on the floor beside the table. Chiboy hovered nearby, uncomfortable with uselessness. The twins leaned on each other on the opposite couch. Then she began. All right, so next chapter will be Wob's Coming To story. That'll be next week on Wednesday. And thanks again for joining. Don't forget to check out the questions that go along with the reading. And I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.